Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a weekly 30-minute radio show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'm going to be doing another solo show. This is part 4 and the concluding segment of a series on the book by Jason Hickel, Less is More. So if you're driving around today and don't catch all of today's show, you can watch today's show and all of our past shows, including the 3 segments that came before this, by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the actions and events page and clicking on Retake Conversations, and you'll find all of our shows there. As is our practice, I want to begin the show by acknowledging that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to express our gratitude to the Tewa people for their stewardship of that land for many, many, many centuries. We could learn a lot from them, as Less is More actually points out repeatedly. I want to also remind you that if you found this extended discussion of Less is More to be interesting, we're conducting a Less is More book club on Zoom on June 8th at 6 p.m. And we'll have a discussion of the assumptions that Hickel makes in laying out his plan for a degrowth or a no-growth future, and the different strategies that he describes. And we'll talk about their relevance. Many of them are international strategies, but some of them are strategies that could easily be adapted and implemented here in New Mexico. And we'll have a good conversation about that. So whether you've read the book or not, and I'd encourage you to do so, you can still participate in what will be a very rich conversation. And if you go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on Rethink in the menu bar, near the top of that page, you will find a link so you can register for the book club conversation. So to catch you up, in part 1, I shared Hickel's views of how capitalism evolved, not out of feudalism, but rather with serfs, choosing to go work in factories for higher wages, but rather after enjoying 150 years post-feudal freedom, if you will, where the commons became common and where the serfs shared land and had the highest level of income and wealth in the history of man. And that was for about 150 years before the nobility and the merchant class that was evolving and developing basically kicked them off the land. And this was done so that the capitalist system had the capital to invest in the industries that were emerging in the merchant period in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So, and then in part 2 and part 3, we discussed the consequences of this, both in terms of the growing wealth inequality in the world and the mass consumption of resources that were basically being extracted from the global South at the great benefit of the global North. And we also spent a fair amount of time in the last show talking about the faulty logic involved in many of the strategies that are hatched by scientists, ecologists, economists, different ways in which we can sustain our economy as a growth economy while addressing climate change. And those are everything from carbon capture to the use of technology and any number of other strategies, carbon pricing, recycling, even an immediate transition to renewables. None of that would work in the absence of a degrowth economy, and he lays that out pretty clearly. And so today, he's set the table. Now we get to find out, what will work, what can we do? And I want to start out by, and I'm going to be reading like I was last time, about some of the strategies he proposes. And one of the first things he says is there's so many things that are in the private sector today that could be in the public sector and free for people like you and I, including education, childcare, and healthcare, and that to the degree that that becomes achievable, then the need for income is reduced, and the incentive to work 2 jobs or even a full-time job may dissipate, because what is important isn't how much you earn, but how much you're able to purchase with what you earn. And so he makes a very, very, very good case for how if we just revitalize the public sector and deprivatize so many aspects of our lives, the cost of life would go down. And then but then he has a number of other interesting strategies. And one of them is something he calls basically a shared economy, where many of the things that we have in our homes are things we may use once a year. Certain kinds of tools, appliances, things that just aren't something that you need on a daily basis. And a shared library kind of thing, or a community setting where those things are loaned out, would make way more sense and reduce consumption significantly. And so that's one of the other things that he talks about. But then he goes on to talk about the importance of redistributing wealth. And this, I think, is at the heart of everything he's writing about. He talks about, it's going to take me a second to see, put these sums to, I'm going to pause this for a moment. Sorry about that. To put things in perspective, he points out that the richest 1% alone capture $19 trillion in income every year, which represents nearly a quarter of global GDP. That adds up to more than the GDP of the poorest 169 countries combined. And so he says that to put these sums into perspective, consider this, that to bring everyone in the world to the income poverty line, above the income poverty line, and to provide universal public health care for every person in the global South at a standard equivalent to that in Costa Rica today, would require $10 trillion a year. That's a significant sum, he points out, but it's also half of what the top 1% earn. And so by various tax structures, reallocating those funds, we could literally lift the entire world out of poverty. And one of his main points is that we're doing these things by choice. We have the power to allow the wealthiest to aggregate all that income, and we have the power to reverse that. And so through various taxes and wealth taxes and so forth. And so then he goes on to talk about other ways in which we could recapture revenue and income. And he talks about the degree to which many corporations pay almost nothing in taxes and shelter their funds, their profits from the global South in banks that don't ask questions and don't and in countries that don't tax very high, like for instance in Ireland. And so he basically states that there are ways in which we could introduce trade and taxes on revenue that shut down those tax evasion systems with laws to regulate cross-border trade and corporate accounting. Another thing that he points out is that this is especially true for the global South, that right now there isn't economic democracy in place in the world. Basically, major decisions about world economies and the global South individual countries' economies are made by the World Trade Fund and the World Bank and the International Money Fund. And the US has basically veto power on that, on both of those bodies. And there's virtually no representation from the global South. And so they're routinely foisted with really onerous debt. And one of the strategies that Hickel describes is that we should just cancel that debt. And that would put an end to that. The way those economies are operating now, they're basically have to live in an austerity budget. They can't provide any services to people. The governance is very unstable because people are so unhappy. They're flowing out of their countries and coming to our doorstep. And this would be a way to start to address that. In a totally different way to address the less is more issue and to get to degrowth, he talks about the idea of eliminating planned obsolescence. He points out that in relation to phones, we have sold billions of phones across the country, across the world, and most of them are obsolete in 2 or 3 years. And that can go for any number of other things. And he talks also about the old historic example of the light bulb, where the light bulb was invented, and there was a real problem with it because it lasted forever, and that didn't make many more resales. And so the General Electric just basically put a kibosh on that and bought up all the patents for the permanent light bulb. So just getting rid of planned obsolescence. He also talks about how just even fashion is planned obsolescence, and how advertising is used to create a sense of need or an absence in your life where just maybe there isn't something there that needs to be, that you need to have. You don't necessarily need to have the newest gadget. And if we just cut our consumption in half, we would basically reduce, it's just not how much we would be producing that we would be reducing, but the transport, the stocking of shelves, the sales process, all of these things consume energy. And by cutting consumption in half, we make a significant inroad towards addressing what is basically was laid out in the third segment of this series, how we are simply in a finite universe, you cannot continue to consume an infinite amount of resources. And so by getting rid of planned obsolescence, by reducing advertising, he just says basically we could reduce the time allowed for advertising or put limits on corporations as to how much money they can spend on marketing and so forth. And so those are just a few of the ways. He also talks about how we currently actually waste half of our food. And it's thrown away, never gets even to the markets. And if we were able to just cut that in half, we would go a long ways towards, again, the processing of the food and the consumption of the amount of land that is used to produce food that then isn't consumed. There are ways that we could curtail that. He then also talks about ecologically destructive industries, and certainly gas and oil would be one of them. But the beef industry, for instance, nearly 60% of global agricultural land is used for beef, either directly for cattle pasture or indirectly for growing food. 60% of all the arable land. It's one of the most resource inefficient foods on the planet in terms of the land and energy it requires per calorie, and the pressure to find land for pasture and feed is the single greatest driver of deforestation. As I write this, the Amazon rainforest is literally being burned for the sake of beef. Yet far from being essential to human diets, beef accounts for only 2% of the calories humans consume. In most cases, the industry could be radically scaled down without any loss to human welfare. And you don't have to be a vegetarian to get this. I mean, it's just switching from beef to plant proteins like beans and pulses could liberate almost 11 million square miles of land, the size of the United States, Canada, and China combined. So these kinds of changes make a no-growth economy much more feasible. And so we're going to move on in that discussion in just a second, but I have to take a little break to remind our listeners that you're listening to KSFR. KSFR is New Mexico, Northern New Mexico's media gem. It's our public radio station. It provides all kinds of tremendous resources and information, whether it's music and discussion of arts, politics, social issues, books. It's and an ongoing stream of music. And I also want to take this moment to thank Sean Conlon, who has been the technology and engineer for KSFR for 19 years, and he is retiring. And so out of gratitude to Sean, I'm asking all of you to go to retakeourdemocracy.org. Click on the, I'm sorry, don't go there. Go to ksfr.org, click on the donate button and make a donation in honor of Sean Conlon. And thank you, Sean. So getting back to less is more, he talks about the need to cut consumption. I mentioned this before. But if we consume half as many products, we also need half as many factories and machines to produce them, half as many airplanes and trucks and ships to transport them, half as many warehouses and retail outlets to distribute them. Roxanne was pointing out something to me today about the shipping industry, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it was staggering. I think the emissions from shipping is more than all of the gas and oil and coal production in the world. And so the emissions resulting from it. And so the carbon footprint on our consumption is enormous. He also talks about reducing the work week. If we're not going to need as much income to purchase the things that we want in our lives, and if we cut down on consumption, and if all kinds of things are free and provided by the government, then we're not going to have to work 40 hours a week. And so our lives, the quality of our lives would be immeasurably improved. And we would have way more time for hobbies, for growing food, for caring for family members, and volunteering in the community. And so it would contribute vastly to the quality of our lives. He also talks about, let's see here now, where are we? Okay. While capitalism has purchased the technology capacity to provide for everyone's needs many times over and to liberate people from unnecessary labor, it deploys that technology instead to create new needs and to endlessly expand the treadmill of production and consumption. The promise of true freedom is perpetually delayed and deferred. He goes on to also talk about another way that we could redistribute wealth is by limiting CEO pay. He points out that in 1965, CEOs earned about 20 times more than the average worker. Today, that they average on average 300 times more. And in some companies, the gap is even more extreme. In 2017, Steve Easterbrook, the CEO of McDonald's, earned $21.7 million, while the median full-time McDonald's worker earned $7,000. There's a ratio of 3,100 to 1. And so one of the things that he suggests is we should just have, return to the tax system of, the 1950s and tax income over a certain amount at 90%. He even says 100%. And doing that on a national scale would generate a significant amount of revenue. But it's not just about income inequality. He talks about wealth inequality as well. The bottom 50% have almost nothing, only 0.4% of the wealth in the world, while the top 1% have 40% of the world's wealth. And so nobody deserves that kind of wealth, he says. It's not earned, it's extracted from underpaid workers, from cheap nature, from rent seeking, from political capture, and so on. Extreme wealth has a corrosive effect on our society, on our political system, and on the living world. We should have a democratic conversation about this. At what point does hoarding become destructive and unacceptable? 100 million, 10 million, 5 million? And so I think these are good conversations to have. This is what we're going to be talking about when we do the book club. It's like, what of these things is practical? Not all of these are exactly, laid out in detail as to how these strategies could be implemented, but quite a number are, and it wouldn't be impossible for us collectively to come up with different ways in which we could just really restructure the way our economy and our politics works, so that we are better able to manage our future. He talks about decommodifying public goods and expanding the commons. As we, there's a quote, as we scale down excess industrial production, we can mitigate impact on livelihoods by distributing labor, income, and wealth more fairly. But there's another crucial point to add. Remember, when it comes to human welfare, it's not income itself that matters, it's welfare, purchasing power. And so that's where he talked a good deal about rent controls so that housing was affordable. And then, of course, as we had mentioned earlier in the show, health and education and childcare, all of these things could be provided for free. And by redistributing the wealth in the country and in the world. And that would just make it so that people were not having to work as hard. And that's a good thing. And then he talks about a concept of radical abundance. He's basically saying that, if we get rid of all the planned obsolescence and so forth, and get rid of artificial scarcity, through advertising and things like this, we won't feel this immense pressure all the time to keep up with the Joneses. Harkening back to the 50s, that's where that phrase even began. The rush to work to keep up deprives us of the opportunity to be part of a caring society. And so he talks quite a bit about that. And then we're getting kind of close to the end of his thoughts on how to affect a degrowth economy. But one of the key pieces he also mentions, both at an international level and at a personal level, is the cancellation of debt. And he cites as from the Bible, and the Jews from ancient times had a practice of Jubilee. Every 7 years, they'd forgive debt for anyone who owed money to anyone else. And there's nothing to say that we can't just say to all the students out there that have immense amount of debt and are enslaved to work, that the debt is gone. And again, this is all possible with a redistribution of wealth in this country. Once we grasp how this works, solutions rush into view. He then provides a sentence that really captures it. Capitalism transforms even the most spectacular gains in productivity and income, not into abundance and human freedom, but into new forms of artificial scarcity. And so, I mean, if you think back to oh my God, am I gonna be able to remember the guy's name? A comedian who did a whole show on, or a skit on stuff, George Carlin. And maybe I'll put that in a post coming up. It's hilarious, but it's like, how much stuff do we actually need? And at what cost are we paying in quality of life to have that stuff? So I think we're not going to have time to get to everything I wanted to talk about today, but one of the things I do want to mention is his perception about money, because he does a pretty good job of explaining something that Ellen Brown in The Web of Debt, her book, The Web of Debt, explains, but it's almost torturous to understand. I still can't quite get my head around how money is created. Let's see if Hickel explains it better than I can. The main reason our economy is so loaded with debt is because it runs on a money system that is itself debt. When you walk into a bank to take out a loan, you might assume that the bank is lending you money it has in its reserve, collected from other people's deposits and stored in a basement vault somewhere. But that's not how it works. It's an accounting practice. Banks are only required to hold reserves worth about 10% of the money they lend out, or even less. This is known as fractional reserve banking. In other words, banks lend out about 10 times more money than they actually have. So where does that extra money come from? If it doesn't actually exist, banks create it out of thin air. And when they credit your account, they literally loan it into existence. Now that's pretty hard to understand, or to grasp. So hard to grasp. Let me just go on and give you another quote from him. In other words, almost every single dollar that passes through our hands represents somebody's debt, and the debt has to be paid back with interest, with more work, more extraction, and more production. This is extraordinary. When you think about it, it means that banks effectively sell a product, money, that they produce out of nothing for free, and then require people to go out into the real world and extract and produce real value to pay for it. It is so outlandish as to offend common sense. People have a difficult time believing it could possibly be true. As Henry Ford put it in the 1930s, quote, "It is perhaps well enough that the people of the nation do not understand or know our banking and monetary systems, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." So, but basically we get caught up in this system of extraction, exploitation, profit, at the expense of the quality of life and the planet. And towards the end of the book, Hickel offers up this analogy. If you've ever watched a game of musical chairs, you have an idea of how this plays out. Each round of the game ramps up the scarcity of chairs, and the players have to fight each other to get to one of the few that are left. It's chaos. Now imagine we up the stakes. Instead of just getting knocked out of the game, you lose your home, your kids go hungry, and you can't pay for medicines. Think about what such a game would look like. The desperate measures people would take to get a chair, the desperate measures people would take to meet their needs. Casual observers of capitalist societies might conclude, as many economists have done, that vicious competition, maximization, and self-interested behavior are hardwired into human nature. But is it really human nature that makes us behave this way? Or is it just the rules of the game? And he reminds us that for many, many centuries, we just didn't operate that. As hunter-gatherers, we worked cooperatively. And so he suggests that rather than having the private banks issue dollars out of credit, out of thin air, and make you pay interest to pay off your loans, that instead the public sector creates public banks that create dollars by lending them, but they lend them for things that are advancing our social purpose. And in that respect, we would be, kind of cutting out the profit-making middleman. And basically, he's suggesting that that be done almost everywhere. If you really think about how people's personal economies function, they're much more people-to-people, small business, and that's the kind of world in which he thinks a no-growth economy would lead to, where we work less hours, where we spend more time with family, where there isn't poverty. I mean, there isn't poverty. Imagine that. So, some of the arguments against a no-growth economy is that it would throw us into recession, but a no-growth economy would only throw a capitalist system into recession, because there wouldn't be the means to continue to produce the goods and services that we have and we rely upon, and things would start to collapse. But if it's picked up by the public sector, then that situation simply doesn't come into play. And so there's a good deal about this book that is, a leap. But as he mentions very early in the book, Darwin was a leap too at one point, and so was Galileo. And yet, after a time, people grew to grasp those concepts, embrace them, and I think that that's what's needed now with this less is more. And so, a lot of what Rethink Our Democracy is doing right now is trying to convey to people how this could happen, open up people's minds to what is possible, that we aren't necessarily a slave to a system the way it has functioned for the last 500 years, and that we could return to a life of balance. So please join us on, we'll be back here again next week with a different show, not about less is more. And but please join us on June 8th at 6 p.m. for the book conversation on less is more. And you can go to retakeourdemocracy.org, click on the Rethink button in the menu bar, and right at the top, you'll see how to register for that conversation. It should be a rich one. And thank you for listening today, and we'll be back next week. This is Paul Gibson saying goodbye, and keep active. It's the only way we change this mess.